Hello and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who'd like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you.
Hello, I'm Helen Leathers, and with me today is my co-host and business partner, Tom Dillon. Hi Tom, how are you?
I am splendid this morning. Thank you very much. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm really looking forward to, almost as much as your response to how are you today, I'm really looking forward to exploring another coaching tool with you. So what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about conflict styles, and we have a tool that will help people to talk about conflict in the coaching room.
Okay, not conflict in the coaching room.
Hopefully not conflict in the coaching room. To be honest, I've been coaching for 14 years. I don't really have conflict it's not something that shows up in my coaching room. I'm sure there must be occasions where it does, but on the whole, it doesn't.
But if someone is having conflict at work or difficulty with actually having a difficult conversation in the workplace, that might come down to their conflict style.
Yes, and there will be people that struggle with conflict in many different ways. So when I was studying for my psychology degree, a German psychoanalyst called Karen Horney was part of that syllabus, and she had some ideas around neuroticism and had some defense strategies that people tended to fall into. So people would either avoid conflict, so they'd move away from it, or they would attack, so they'd be quite combative, or they would appease, so they would do people pleasing, be accommodating. So those were her three defense strategies that she recognized that people tended to fit into. And much later in the 1970s, a couple of psychologists called Thomas and Kilmann came up with a conflict styles model, and that's what we're going to explore today. So, and it does build on that, because what we're looking at are those defense strategies alongside some more useful strategies.
So can I just check in with you here? Because quite often I hear people saying, I don't like conflict. And what they mean is, when we explore it a bit more, is they don't like difficult conversations. So this model isn't just about when people are at loggerheads, when there is a real conflict in the workplace or perhaps in the home or in a social situation. It could extend to how we deal with challenging, difficult behaviour, having conversation around boundaries, or any of those what we perceive to be difficult conversations.
Yes, and if you think about it in a wider context, it extends to any form of negotiation. So we will have different styles and different ways of showing up when we are negotiating over anything. And on a previous podcast, we talked about perhaps someone not turning up to a coaching session and what we do about that. Now, if you have a combative attack style to your conflict, you might go, well, you didn't turn up. You were supposed to give me 48 hours notice. I'm going to charge you. That could be your approach. Now, you say it in gentler language, but that could be your approach. If you have an accommodating conflict style, you go, oh, don't worry about it. It's fine. I know I've got that in my contract, but it doesn't mean anything. You don't have to pay. That's for other people. So that could be an accommodating style. Or you might just avoid it altogether. You might never address the fact that the person was late. Just, oh, okay, well, let's book you in for the next session. So it could be you adopt one of those defense strategies.
Interesting.
So the other two styles that Thomas and Kilmann came up with in the way that people have conflict styles are collaboration and compromise, which obviously are much more cooperative. So if we have, although actually not more cooperative than accommodation, because that is very cooperative, but just not assertive.
But cooperative would indicate that it was almost like a win-win situation, whereas accommodating tends to be someone mostly giving in.
Yes, which is of course a lose-win situation. So if we think about this model, and if you imagine a grid with two axes, so one axis is assertiveness and one axis is collaboration or cooperation, then each of these would sit somewhere along that. So accommodating is the least assertive way of being. people tend to think avoiding difficult conversations is probably the weakest position, but actually accommodating is the weakest position, because you just give everything up. You just say, oh, okay, we'll do what you want. So sometimes avoiding can be quite a strong position, because you just never have the conversation and you get away with something. So accommodating is the weakest position, the least assertive, but one of the most cooperative.
And we'll share this image, if you
We
like,
will share this model
notes.
in the show notes, yes. So we will tend to have one of those styles, and I think people will recognise. Whenever I do work with people and I show them this model, they go, oh yeah, I'm there. I'm that person that just gives in. Or I just don't have difficult conversations, I just avoid them. Or they might be in the coaching room because their conflict style is very combative and they're upsetting people. And it's been suggested that they have some coaching
around it, yeah.
They might be seen as bullying, when actually it's just their conflict style is, I'm going to win.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't care whether you lose, but I'm going to win. So that much more, win-lose style.
So you've mentioned some reasons why people might find this model useful. Why is it useful for the coach to be familiar with it?
I think it's useful for coaches to have an awareness of it and be able to talk through it, to allow their coachee to better understand the situation that they're facing. So whilst people might understand what their conflict style is, and they might say, oh yeah, well, I'm a people pleaser, or yeah, I just don't have difficult conversations, I just avoid them, they might not have thought of a different way of being. And actually showing them a model where, okay, on the one hand, you're being very cooperative by being accommodating, but you're not being very assertive at all, and there are other ways of doing this, I think could be really useful just to flex people's thinking. We've said on this podcast before that my whole aim in coaching is to generate some new thinking. So if someone has a way of being, and that's just how they are, and they're just very accepting of how they deal with conflict, to actually show them other ways that they could be, and maybe encourage them to flex into that from time to time. In a cognitive behavioural way, they might say, okay, the next time this comes up, what might you do differently? How might you approach this in a way that allows you that flexibility of thinking to go to a different place with it?
To perhaps be more assertive, maybe a little less accommodating.
Yeah.
Or to be more accommodating if
you have a very command and control way of being, maybe you're a leader in an organisation and you just, well, it's my way or the highway, that is in that competitive win-lose box of being very assertive, very not very cooperative. So again, it might be that if you are working with someone who has that style, but they're running into problems because people aren't doing what they say, and that's leading to other problems, just that recognising that there is a different way of being. So actually collaboration could put everyone in a safer place. They might have to spend more time talking to people, but if they can collaborate to come up with the right way forward as a group of people, get buy-in from everyone else because they've collaborated, most people, when asked their opinion, will be happy with whatever gets decided because they've been included in the conversation. So I think just being willing to go there, have that conversation will help. But people might not be aware of that style. If all of their experience has been around command and control, then they might say, well, that's the way that you lead people. So again, I think it's a useful information sharing model where people can see there are different ways to be.
So of these conflict styles, which is the most useful, do you think?
I think they all have their place. And that's the helpful thing about the model. It's not saying, well, if you have that competitive way of being, the competing style, that you're in the wrong all the time, because there may be times when that is a really useful way to be, but not always. So it's all about that flexibility to adapt your style depending on the circumstances. So if we think about firefighters attending a fire, and you've got someone in control who might be barking orders in that moment, and they will just tell people what to do, no one's going to get upset by that, because that's the psychological contract they have for that scenario, that that's what happens. Someone gives orders. Someone has to give the orders. But no one's going to be offended by that. So if quick, decisive action is required, then that the competing style might be quite useful.
Okay.
And obviously, if you're in a position of power, you could use it anyway. Whether it's but that's when you've got power is probably the time that you are going to use it. But it can be useful in certain circumstances. And it might be that you are just so adamant that you are right and that you feel strongly about a situation that you use that style because you're not prepared to give any ground. And it is sort of, well, we either do this or I walk away could be your negotiation tactic. And that's fair, It might be that you feel so strongly about it. So there may be times when that can be really useful.
I have done that in a job before.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know.
Back in the day when smoking was allowed in the office, and I was not made aware that the managers smoked in their office, but it was all open plan, so they'd open their doors and all the smoke would come into the office.
Now, I would suggest that your conflict style isn't usually compete.
No, not at all. No, we're going back a few years. I was in my early 20s, and I would avoid any conflict at all. And I didn't have any conversations and went straight into change this or I leave. Yeah. Which, is from one extreme to the other.
Yes.
And they said, bye.
Yeah, good negotiation.
So I had to then walk out. And you do need to be able to follow through. It was the best thing I did. I didn't need to be there, but it was, yes, I was quite surprised. They just went, okay, bye.
Yeah, so that competing, so they had that, they weren't prepared to budge on that. That's our position, you've got your position, and no deal might be the outcome. And that's a fair outcome. There doesn't have to be a deal done, does there? It's just we go our separate ways. So that's competing. And if we then go to the other extreme, and I think accommodating is the weakest place to be. So we are giving in, basically. We're giving people what they want. So they say, well, I want this. Okay, you can have it. Now, there may be times when you really don't care for what they want. So they say, well, I need you to work on Tuesday. And actually it suits you to work on Tuesday. They go, yeah, okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
The only problem with that, I think, is that it can lead to training them that you'll do that.
Yes.
So there's some inference taken that you will always be accommodating, and then it's a bit of a shock when you're not. So I think we have to be careful with that. So the accommodating has its uses. I say if it matters much more to them than it does to you, then maybe you might be buying some goodwill by being accommodating and using that style.
But I think it links into with struggling with setting boundaries, which we've talked about in a previous episode. So I think if your style is accommodating, sometimes perhaps change it up and practice not being quite so accommodating.
Yes, and we know that a lot of doctors are people pleasers. They're in a caring profession, so they tend to have that people pleasing approach, which can be problematic, as we've discussed before. And I think this is that style, accommodating. Yes, okay, I'll do what you ask.
Yeah.
But times when it could be useful is when you really don't care about the outcome and are happy to do whatever they say. Maybe also if you have no power in the situation. So arguing is pointless. You might go, okay, we'll fight a different battle at another time, but you might give in that moment. But that is a lose-win situation in most circumstances. So that's at the other end. Avoiding, obviously, this is something that we come across a lot, I think, in the coaching room, where people want some change to happen, but they're just not doing anything about it. They're just avoiding it because it's uncomfortable. And with any form of negotiation is likely to lead to some discomfort in the person having that negotiation or that conflict, that difficult conversation. So I think we're getting used to it being uncomfortable, and I think the more you do it, the more comfortable you become with it, and thinking through what's going to happen if you have the conversation, what the likely outcome, and this is great work to do in the coaching room to explore that conversation, and maybe do an empty chair exercise where the person has the conversation with themselves and plays both parts of it, and they work through that conversation in the coaching room, which makes it much easier to have the conversation later. But if we're just avoiding the situation, that's probably not going to serve us terribly well. Say, unless by avoiding it we get out of doing something we don't want to do.
Well, I think that there have been times when perhaps I've had an email and I've not wanted to deal with it, so I have avoided responding. And by the time I've got to the point where I think I actually do have to respond to that email and have that difficult conversation, I've had another one saying that situation has been resolved.
Yeah.
And, great. I didn't have to have that difficult conversation.
Yeah.
Perhaps not always ideal, but sometimes it can work in our favour.
Yeah, and I was thinking of a situation perhaps where a family member is likely to call on you for help at a point that you're not willing to provide that help. Maybe that they're doing something at the weekend and you might get a phone call to say, can you babysit? But you really don't want to. You might not pick the phone up.
Yeah.
You might get back to them 2 days later. So that avoiding thing might suit us at times. So I don't think it's a great way to be. I think with any difficult conversation, any conversation that's important, I think it's useful to have the conversation.
Yeah.
And not avoid it. But there may be times when it suits you to do that.
Yeah. And what's the next style that we're talking about?
So we've now got competing at the other end, we've got accommodating, and then avoiding is kind of sits down at that end of not being very assertive. In the middle, we've got compromising. And this could be a win-win. So if you think about union negotiations, there are lots of strikes happening all over the country at the moment. And if you think about the two sides, they are compromising. They come to the table knowing they're going to have to compromise. There isn't going to be anyone accommodating. They will compete. That will be the language they use. But they know that at some point they're going to have to compromise. So that compromising is very much, we're going to give something up, but we expect you to give something up too. And somehow we'll meet in the middle. Now, that could be win-win, but it could be lose-lose because no one gets what they want.
Yeah.
So no one quite gets the pay rise they want, and
win a bit, lose a bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but it could be seen as a lose-lose if everyone leaves the negotiation table dissatisfied, then that's lose-lose. But it's more collaborative. So we're moving up the scale in terms of collaboration, and it's more assertive because we're arguing our case. We're having a conversation about what's important. So that's a better place to be. But ultimately, we want to, in most situations, we want to get to the point of collaborating, where we sit down, there's a problem on the table, and we explore how we are going to come to an outcome that's satisfactory for everyone. And I think that collaboration is where we tend to have more win-win situations. And it could be that it comes way ahead of any negotiation because we've got a plan. We know how we're moving forward. We don't need to stop and sort out difficulties because we've talked about it already. So the more collaboration that we can have. Now, there are times when there isn't time for collaboration and someone just needs to make a decision, which might then lead to more difficulties and more negotiation. But I think collaboration is the most assertive place to be and the most cooperative place to be. Now, if as a coach you have an awareness of that model and you can share that model with your coachee and give them some different options of how they might approach a situation, I think that can be really helpful. So rather than avoiding it, saying, okay, what if you were to have a conversation in which you collaborated with your line manager and actually discussed the problem fully? What do you think the difference might be there? So I think just exploring conversations that need to be had in the coaching room is... I love talking about difficult conversations with people because I recognise that it's a big problem in organisations, that communication, where people perhaps have some resentment, some frustration with what's going on, but never tell anyone. And then all of a sudden it blows up and, well, where did that come from? We had no idea something was wrong.
Yes.
So the more we can talk to one another and express how we're feeling and be assertive, we don't have to be aggressive, so we're not in that competing zone, but we can be assertive and collaborative cooperative at the same time. So I think it's a great model. To say it's been around since the 70s, but I think it stood the test of time. I think it combines those difficulties that people have. So the work of Karen Horney, of those defence strategies. So if we go into not quite a fight or flight response, but that might be part of what's happening for us. So we become defensive, and so we either attack or we appease or we avoid. Those are kind of three defence strategies that we might do in a real fight or flight situation. So we might run away, which is avoid. We might attack as a form of defence. Or we might do that fawning thing that some animals do when they're being attacked. They kind of try and make it all better, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And you say about organisations, and obviously we are talking to doctors and looking at medical environments, but I mean, absolutely, this extends into every aspect of our life, doesn't it? It extends into relationships, extends into home life, family, social situations. And I know having better conversations is a real passion of yours. And if people can have those conversations early, like you say, in every aspect of their life, it makes having the more challenging conversations easier, because people already know your stance on things, and it probably will reduce the risk of conflict, but it will also make it easier to have those negotiations when conflict arises.
Yeah, and the earlier the conversation, the better. I think that's the avoiding thing doesn't generally work.
Because we're not taught how to have those conversations, are we? And what we are taught by default, by observation, by living is with people is the way they handle. So we probably learn a lot from our parents about how to handle conversations and conflict. And then no one else tells us what to do after that, do they? So we have a default style. And this work is about growing, learning, developing new ways of being. So
it
I
is
like
that
this
flexibility of thinking. So that's my normal style. Avoiding is what I normally do, but actually this is quite important. So I'm going to have that conversation, and I'm going to have it in a collaborative way. I'm not going to be going in all guns blazing, shouting and screaming about what I want, but I'm going to have a conversation. And I was coaching a GP recently who was coming to the end of her retainer with an organisation and knew that she was going to have a conversation with the business manager of the practice, and in her head was thinking, well, they're never going to give me what they want. But actually what we did in that room, we did a bit of an empty chair exercise where she talked with herself. I wasn't involved, I just watched. She talked through both sides of the conversation. So she said out loud what she wanted to say to the business manager. She put herself in his position and said out loud what she thought he might say in response, and just played that conversation out. And then when she went into that meeting with her business manager, was able to be assertive, cooperative, so she was collaborating, but being assertive and exploring the situation with him. It ended up with her leaving and being told, well, you decide what you want and we'll see what we can do. So they were talking about being accommodating for her request, where she really thought they were going to be, nope, you do what we want or we don't want you. So she thought they were going to be in that competitive style, but were actually in quite an accommodating style. So
an example of where this model, explained and explored, has really helped a coaching client to move things forward.
And obviously we see, we work with GPs from both sides of the fence. So we work with GPs who are perhaps locums or on a retainer, who are having to negotiate with practice partners. And we work with practice partners who are having to navigate that space of running a business and getting staff and keeping staff. So useful again for the practice partners to be thinking about what their style is and what style is going to be useful in those negotiations with their locum GPs, their salaried GPs. It's all, you can't run a business without some form of negotiation going on.
No, and conversation, so important. Is there anything you want to add to this?
No, I think that's been quite a good review of Thomas and Kilmann's conflict styles, which I think can be a really powerful tool in the coaching room to help people understand their own conflict styles, but also to explore flexibility around using different styles.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's such a great topic to explore, and I know it can really help people broaden their thinking and see things from different perspectives and find new ways of being. So thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
And next time on this podcast, we are exploring a topic that often comes up in the coaching room, directly or indirectly, and that is one of your favourite topics, Tom. Is it resilience? It's resilience. Absolutely. So
I shall look forward to that.
We'll see you next time on the podcast. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.